Hello, greetings. Excuse me. Hello, everyone. So, if you've ever been on the London Underground train system or the tube, right, they've got signs and they'll say over the loudspeaker, mind the gap. In British English, the word mind can be a verb that means pay attention to or be aware of. So when they say mind the gap, they mean be aware of the space between the train and the platform so that you don't step into it. Um, well, one of the most important practices, one of the most important micro meditations of Tantric Yoga is to mind the gap, but in this case, so that you can step into it. So, to become aware of the space between the thoughts, between moods as well. The verse of the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra that teaches this practice uses the word bhāva, and bhāva means a mental emotional state, a mood, a thought. It's quite a flexible word. So in this practice, we're becoming aware of the space between the trains of thought and the space between changing moods as well, right? But let's just start with noticing that throughout the day, you're thinking. One tends to be thinking. Most humans are thinking most of the time. Now, some humans think verbally, right? They've got sort of verbal thoughts going on, an internal monologue, or even an internal dialogue. Uh, and other humans don't think verbally, but they are thinking, right? So they can be sort of worried and yeah, but they're not actually having verbal thoughts, but it's still thinking. It's just nonverbal. Um, but whatever kind of thinking you engage in, then whether it's visual, verbal, or whatever, there's always a space between thoughts, or to be more accurate, a space between trains of thought, right? Because one thought will lead to another, will lead to another, will lead to another in a kind of free association stream of consciousness, as it's called in English. Um, but there's inevitably a pause, and this pause actually happens if you care to pay attention to it every few minutes. And this is if you're not trying to interfere at all. I mean, you're not even trying to make pauses. Still, there is a pause every few minutes between when one train of thought comes to an end and before the next one begins. And for many people, this pause is only a couple seconds, but that's all you need. That's all you need. You're just gonna mind the gap. Pay attention to that pause. Now, if you're especially worried or triggered, then it's very difficult to do this, right? Because you're compulsively thinking. So one train of thought comes to an end, you have a split second even, and the next one starts, right? So it's important to become convinced that thinking all the time is not actually going to help you. It's not actually going to make you safer. It's not actually going to make you happier. It's not going to actually make you more aware. Some thinking, of course, is important. Thinking through an issue can be a way of, kind of processing the various factors and features of that issue to come to some sort of decision. You don't actually need to think to come to a decision, but most people are not trained well in the intuitive art of coming to a decision without thinking, and therefore, without that training, they tend to need to think, right? But we think at least 10 times more than we need to. Some of us much more than that. But so, I'm not saying no thinking, right? That would be absurd. But we think a lot more than we need to. And here's the important thing: there's diminishing returns, right? Thinking twice as much about a problem or an issue doesn't make you twice as safe, doesn't make you twice as good at coping. It doesn't. Just pay attention to your own experience. You'll see that. This is absolutely guaranteed. So thinking a certain amount about an issue or problem is important. I would say most people should do that, you know. But it's not the case that thinking twice as much or 4 times as much makes you 4 times more capable, safe, or aware, right? So becoming convinced of this will enable you to dive into the space between the thoughts or the trains of thought and trust that that is beneficial, right? It's a leap of faith, in a sense. So the verse 61 of Vijnana Bhairava Tantra has this beautiful phrase, and it is madhyam samashrayet. Take refuge in the center. Take total refuge, samashrayet, in the center, madhyam. And that verb, to take refuge, I mean, originally this verb in Sanskrit was used for kind of when you're out in the hot midday sun, you take refuge in the shade of a beautiful, huge tree, right? And that same verb, to take refuge, originally in the context of, you know, taking physical refuge from the heat of the sun, came to be used for taking refuge in a specific teaching or tradition or lineage, right? Which, like the shade of a tree, protects you from the scorching heat or burning of worldly suffering. And here we get this beautiful phrase, take refuge in the center, the madhya. And the madhya in this verse means the space between the thoughts or the moods. And in other contexts, the madhya also means the central channel, the center, the core. It's also sometimes equivalent to heart, where heart means not the emotional heart, but the absolute center of your being. So, take refuge in the center. Madhyam samashrayet. It really is a profound refuge. So what do? You just, instead of trying to control your mind, you simply wait for the opportunity. Wait for the opportunity. Notice the space. Breathe. Let yourself fall into that peaceful space between the trains of thought. Even when your mind is very worried, the underlying consciousness is not worried. The consciousness, the power by which you know that you are thinking, the power by which you know that you are worried, awareness itself is never disturbed. It's never disturbed by what it's aware of. And that's what you're noticing when you take refuge in the center. You're noticing that awareness is not disturbed by the mind's disturbance. And so you just let yourself fall into it. And then a new train of thought starts a few seconds later, or a minute later, or whatever it is. Fine. Okay. Now there's 2 ways to do this practice taught in the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra. One is just notice these spaces, these gaps between the thoughts. And the other is to try to lengthen them, right? The verse immediately after, verse 62, teaches lengthening those gaps or spaces, right? So just staying with it as long as you can, gently resisting the temptation to go to the next train of thought too soon, right? So what I recommend also is getting outside and sitting on the earth, it can help to ground you in the space between the thoughts, right? So once you've chosen a course of action, you don't need more information. If you're really not sure that your course of action is the right one, maybe you do need more information. But if you're sure your course of action is the right one, you don't need more information. You don't need to keep pouring more information into your head, right? You need some, but not so much. Please connect to your heart, connect to the earth. Maybe call a friend and meditate with them instead of just talking about current events. Please stay sane as well as staying healthy. So, thank you all. Even if the video ends now, I want to encourage you to take a few minutes to be with that space between the trains of thought, between the feelings, between the surge of one emotion and the next surge or a different emotion. Just be with that space. Take refuge in the center. Madhyam samashrayet. And I know it might seem crazy to say this in times like these, but everything is okay. Everything's okay. Life knows what it's doing. Om. Love to all.